So should we start?
Yep.
Okay,
So
so yeah, this is a study into the effect of anthropomorphic design on knowledge retention in multimedia learning. So the research area for this is multimedia learning, emotional design, and anthropomorphism. The reason I'm focusing on multimedia learning is that it's been around since the beginning of use with computers, multimedia learning, and organizations tend to rely on it a lot to cut training time and travel costs with global organizations. So people are subjected to it quite a lot. But how we learn and research into how we learn is relatively in its infancy. That was true in 2012 when Plas and Homer researched emotional design and multimedia learning in some studies that I'll talk about. But since then, there hasn't been a lot of progress. There has been some focus on different design elements such as anthropomorphism and its efficacy. So a review of the literature. There's a lot of names I'm going to cover, but in four main areas. So the studies into emotional design I'll circle back to. First, I'll discuss emotion in relation to user experience and user needs, positive learning emotions, how it affects the cognitive theory, and then I'll circle back to the studies. So when it comes to user needs, there's the hierarchy of needs that Maslow came up with in 1954. And since then, for product design, Jordan in 1999 discussed how that could be altered for use with products with pleasurability at the top and functionality at the bottom. And more recently, then Walter translated it into a hierarchy of user needs, where it needs to first be functional, reliable, then usable, and then pleasurable to round out the experience. However, he noted that a large amount of this pleasurability is missing in design rigor. So when we're thinking about pleasurability and we're thinking about emotion and effect, we need to think about how it's discussed in a scientific context. So we need to talk about the vocabulary. So the difference between, let's say, emotion and affect specifically is when you map emotion based on valence and arousal. So valence being how pleasurable or displeasurable it is, and arousal being how activated you are or deactivated. Moving on from this, there's discussions of affective processing. Norman discussed affective processing from visceral, behavioral to reflective. Visceral being how you see something, behavioral being how you interact with it, how usable it is, and then reflective then being the story that you tell about your interaction with that thing, with your reflective level. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay,
I
Yes,
can
no
hear you.
problem.
Yeah.
I'm getting a bunch of reconnects here. So with reflectiveness being at the top, not directly attributed to the sensory or motor aspect, but it educates the behavioral. And when we move on then and we come back to affect, and we think about that reflective layer being the stories you tell or the memory that and recall involved, there's memory narrowing and memory broadening. So early studies into memory and emotion with Levine and Edelstein in 2009, they had something that was just referred to as memory narrowing. When you have intense memories centered around an event, you have great memory for how that event transpired, but it falters in the peripheral details. In the center here, we have neutral emotion, which had much greater peripheral detail, but much less recall in general. And then there was an expansion on memory narrowing to introduce memory broadening, where positive active emotions actually gave better recall with greater peripheral recall. And this is what's referred to by the studies into emotion and multimedia learning as positive learning emotions. So when we think about the cognitive theory and how that impacts the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, we see with Meyer's cognitive theory here, he discusses how words and pictures together are better for recall than any on its own. And that cognitive theory since 2009 has evolved. So, well, there has been discussion on how regulation and reflection and effect can influence these since his inception of the cognitive theory. And most recently with Plas, who was involved in some of the core papers that I'll be discussing later, talking about how affect is a new channel into how you integrate emotion. So it's a new stream, and all three, like text, visuals, and emotion, all need to be respected in order to maximize your ability to integrate information. Moving on from that, we can discuss the papers in question. So Plass, Hayward, and Homer in 2012 proved, well, were successful in showing that cognition and positive emotion could be increased through the design, specifically color theory and anthropomorphization. Since then, Park and Plass tried to explore the effect of anthropomorphism alone, and were not able to statistically significantly say that it on its own proved that it could do this. Similarly, on another offshoot study, Maramahallo and Lange in 2017 tried to do the same thing with equal results that resulted in a null hypothesis. But moving on from here, I've decided to focus on this because of the limitations of these previous studies. Participants were all secondary school students, and the source content was exclusively medical. So the disconnect from the content could be an issue. Also, the simplicity in the design included a lack of expression. And it's been shown that empathy triggers can affect emotions in many ways, and a lack of ability to empathize with the character graphics in question could have been an issue. So these research questions are: do learners experience more positive active emotions when presented with learning content that includes emotive anthropomorphized learning visuals compared to unanthropomorphized emotionally neutral visuals? And then secondarily, do emotive anthropomorphic visuals or neutral visuals have greater positive influence on knowledge retention in learners? So the methodology employed here is a research through design approach that begins with research for design. The research for design begins with desk research, competitor analysis, and a review of the literature. That educates the interviews which were conducted with experts in the field. And then, using both the desk research and the interviews and the insights gleaned there, a survey was conducted to understand the audience. And taking this information, it went into the design of an artifact. And this artifact would then be using emotional design theory in a learning environment. And that was tested using Maze, which is an online remote testing tool, and it was analyzed in SPSS. So the initial research here was a competitor analysis looking into some of the key competitors. Some of this was just from an initial investigation of what was out there, some of the more popular offerings, and this was further educated by the interviews and the work survey. And the semi-structured interview that was conducted involved kind of like screener questions, a discussion and exploration of learning content, workplace training, audience skill gaps, and then a review of the competitors and any parting thoughts that the experts would go with. So there were survey results, largely finding that people were in like large organizations, and a lot of people had experienced a lot of multimedia learning, with the onboarding training that they'd experienced split between e-learning classroom and shadowing. And the persona that came out of that was Jane. So I'm not going to go into this in detail. She's a new hire in a large organization, and she's onboarding. And then the idea being that if your onboarding experience is better, you learn more, and then it has a more positive outlook on your interactions with people within the workplace. So moving on to the design. Some different emotional design aspects were explored. Contour bias is one, a tendency to favor objects with contours over sharp angles. And babyface bias is known emotional design principle. This was explored in and Plass's work in multimedia learning, but they referred to babyface bias generally from the contours present, opposed to specifically large eyes and different babyish features. Color theory is, it was identified that yellow, orange, and pink are positive, like positive emotional colors, and the color that was chosen is Living Coral, which sits between orange and pink. And color palette was chosen based on Universal Design. Lidwell described situations in nature to have particularly beautiful color palettes. Moving forward, the design of this character needed to have an emotive capability. So Paul Ekman's 6 basic emotions were looked at. And taking all of this into account, you can see how like simplistic characters can also emote quite well. So companies like Pixar and Disney leverage Ekman's work in basic emotions and facial action coding to show how even simplistic characters can emote. So with the character designs, there were different iterations here. Early designs were relatively simple, trying to leverage things like curves, but had lots of right angles. Iteration 2 was a lot more natural, but it was quite masculine, and a further exploration of the literature around it found that masculinity can be quite hindering and increase frustration. So some of these were toned down for iteration 3, and the final pieces of expression like the sclera around the eye were introduced. And then this was mapped to the 6 basic emotions to check its efficacy and its ability to emote. And then this basic emotions were used as kind of a color palette, um, an emotion palette, and they could be combined to create more complex emotions. So learning artifact iteration 1, these weren't so much tested with users as they were used as explorations, and they were discussed in informal interviews and their efficacy. Teaching content being like in a web-based form with an ability for the learner to get feedback and fail moving forward. But it was considered that, well, number one, it would be far too long, and there's quite a novel aspect to this approach, and the personalization of it. Novelness and personalization are known to influence affect. Also, to give this level of feedback, there would need to have been heavy contribution from experts in the field. The subject matter that was chosen was panic attacks. It's medical in nature and needs to be treated quite lightly. So a more simplistic learning artifact was devised where it's simply giving you the symptoms of a panic attack, and then it tests your recall in that area. So here's some of the artifact screens. It shows that there's contour and color in both, but emotion is the increased layer here. This is the independent variable that we're using. Okay, so remote A/B testing then was conducted. There was a pre-survey and a post-survey, which were our primary captures, and it would test knowledge and positive affect before and after. So test of prior knowledge and test of knowledge gained, and test of effect to begin with, and then test of effect afterwards. And the positive effect scale is part of the positive and negative effect schedule. That is a 20-part questionnaire that tests positive and negative emotions. But the positive effect scale is just the 10 positive emotions that were taken out and used in previous studies to effectively gauge learner affect. So when we discuss the results, we'll talk about the knowledge and the affect. So with the results with knowledge, we can see here the two groups performed comparably, very similarly, and there was no significance in the group factor, which would be the treatment that they experienced. And we can see with the box plot, they're very similar in the way that they performed. One thing that's interesting though is there was 30 participants per group, but only 5 per group came back for the long-term recall. So while this is not a statistically significant finding, it was interesting to see that the proof group actually performed worse overall than the control group, seeing as they had a higher starting grade and finishing grade, but in the end they came back to just below the control group.
2 minutes left, Andrew.
Okay, so with iterating the remote test, to begin with, positive effect was identical, and I found that to be a problem with the controls, so I used them as is, and it's like, how enthusiastic do you feel? There was kind of confusion over what that was about. So a revision of how enthusiastic do you feel right now actually showed that there was an increase in the proof group. So that went from being a very insignificant result to quite significant just in the phrasing of the questions. And then here we can see it is close to significant, but not when you look at the difference between the two groups. And further on the box plot. And one thing that's interesting is an independent samples t-test of the prior versus post states. They were quite similar in the prior states, and then there was a statistical significant difference in their post states. So when we take the questions and we turn them into and we have them as hypotheses, we have to reject the proof and the hypotheses, and we have to accept the null in that neither were statistically significant results, and we can't say with any certainty that there was a significant difference in the anthropomorphic design. So it's not significant, but it's improved. We see a greater increase in positive effect compared to previous attempts, and we have a closer look into the specific design methods and theory for emotional multimedia learning. and future work. In-person capture methods to capture exactly how users are feeling during the test would probably produce more granular results on exactly what parts of the design worked and which didn't. And that's it. I'd like to thank the lecturing staff in IIDT, specifically Denise, particularly Denise, for her encouragement through all this, and all of my class who have been fantastic, and particularly Rob, who volunteered an hour and a half of his time to try to help me figure out the stats on this. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you. Well done.
Andrew, before you unshare your screen, could you just throw up your design work there,
Okay, hold on.
please?
This stuff.
Okay, so this is what the user saw on the left and the right.
Oh yeah, so this is so on the left here is the control group and here is the proof group. Yeah, it's quite small when I put them side by side, but they were full screen, yeah.
This is embedded within a web app or a mobile app, or?
This was designed using Articulate 360, which is an e-learning authoring tool, but realistically it could have been designed in anything because there was very little functionality in the end. It was just forward and back and then moving through. And then it was a web object that I then transformed into an InVision app prototype, which was able to be installed into Maze.
Okay, and it looked kind of like this, like there wasn't much else going on?
No, that was pretty much it. So it was like it like had introduction splash pages, then introduction definition, and it's like, okay, now you're about to learn something, and then it went through the 13 symptoms, and then it was like, okay, now you're done.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Okay, so this, yeah, this is what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'll leave it up. There was a lot of slides in case there's any questions on them.
Hi, and I just have a question going back to the research gap. You said the limitations of previous studies that participants were all secondary school students, which is fine, and it was their medical content. And then you said simplistic design and lack of expression. Was this your personal opinion, or was this findings as a result of the research that you were
It was it came through in the interviews when part of the interview was showing competitor examples. So it came through, a lot of the interviews were talking about like it was kind of both, to be honest, but a lot of the interviews showed these designs to be clunky and basic and kind of unrelatable. They kind of have blank expressions on their face, not a heavy level of emotion there, and they didn't find them very relatable.
Okay. And you said you interviewed experts. So what are they, designers or
they were two learning consultants with 20 plus years in the field and one enablement program manager in Google.
Okay, grand. Thank you. Thanks for that.
And just one question, Andrew. You said you had 26 participants for pre and post testing.
30.
30.
30 per group, and they were tested pre and post. Sorry.
All right, 30 per group. I thought I saw in 26 on the statistics slide.
Oh,
there.
you did, yeah. Sorry. There were 30 pre and post, and 4 of them had to be discounted on each side for different reasons. Some of them dropped off, and yeah.
Right. So I guess with the bigger, you know, for future research, you're saying that you would use in-capture methods to capture more data on the user's experience while using the pleasurable design. 26, yeah, probably if you had more, you might get more statistical difference. But coming back to a similar question I asked a former student, why do you think there was no difference, seeing that obviously it's visually more pleasurable, like the positive effect scale showed no difference?
Well, the positive effect scale, it's a good question. There was some difference, and it was close. It was much closer than previous efforts, but yeah, still statistically insignificant. This is why I think that during the learning event, it would be great to see what specific character treatments resonated with the learner and why. So you could kind of see point by point. There were 13 symptoms and then 2 pre-pages. There were 15 treatments total. It would have been interesting to kind of see exactly which treatments evoked a positive response, and then maybe ones that hindered it, and then discuss with the user exactly why that was, and perform kind of an explanatory mixed method to analyze and refactor the designs and see if you could remove some of those snags and increase the positive effect, hypothetically.
Right, yeah, good answer. It strikes me that people have learned a lot from the research process itself when they're able to critique how to improve the work.
Yeah, it was a big learning for me because my iterations largely came from how I posed the questions to the learner and how I got the emotional information out of them. It was crazy to me to see how different the statistics were when you like added a couple of words to the question, because the opening to this was like, okay, say how you feel right now, and then it gave them a bunch of different feelings, but they kind of forgot that. So when it asked them how they feel right now every time, it actually became a noticeably different result.
Thank you.
Did everyone? Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.